I'm Calvin, 40 male. For 20 years, I built my life around the scent of sawdust and the solid feel of timber under my hands. I live in a small town where your last name is your legacy, and for a long time, mine was a good one. But in the span of a few short weeks, it all turned to ash, and a cryptic phone call in the dead of night sent me to my father's grave with a shovel in my hand. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My business, Hayes Custom Carpentry, wasn't just a job, it was my identity. I'd inherited the trade from my father, Arthur Hayes, a man who could communicate more with a sharp glance over a piece of wood than most men could with 1,000 words. He was a stern, quiet figure, built from the same unyielding oak he loved to work with. He taught me that a man's value was measured by the sweat on his brow and the stability he provided for his family. For most of my life, I thought I was meeting that standard. My workshop was my sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world was silenced by the hum of the table saw and the rhythmic scrape of a hand plane. I didn't just build cabinets and furniture, I crafted pieces of people's lives. Each project was a testament to the Hayes name, a symbol of quality and endurance. My wife Jenna used to joke that I had sawdust in my veins. We'd been together since high school, and for years she was the bedrock of my world. She understood the long hours, the calloused hands, and the quiet pride I took in my work. Our children, Lily and Sam, grew up with the workshop as their playground, their small hands tracing the grain of unfinished wood. But the world outside my workshop began to change. A slow-moving economic downturn that felt distant at first began to creep into our town like a fog. The big-ticket orders for custom kitchens and heirloom dining tables slowed to a trickle. People started opting for cheaper, mass-produced furniture, the kind of stuff designed to fall apart in a few years. I refused to compromise on quality, stubbornly believing that craftsmanship would win out. It was a costly mistake. The first sign of serious trouble was a missed payment to my lumber supplier, a man I'd known for 15 years. The phone call was awkward, full of polite but firm reminders. Then another payment was late, this time for the lease on my workshop. The calls became less polite. I started lying awake at night, the numbers swirling in my head, a tangled mess of outgoing expenses and non-existent income. I cut costs everywhere I could, working with cheaper materials when I had to, a compromise that felt like a betrayal of my father's teachings. I let go of my one apprentice, a good kid with a family to feed, and the guilt of that decision ate at me. The silence in the workshop grew heavier each day. The constant hum of machinery was replaced by a hollow echo. Dust, my old enemy, began to settle on the tools I once wielded with confidence. The scent of fresh-cut pine was replaced by the stale odor of failure. That failure followed me home. The strain began to show on Jenna's face. The easy smiles we used to share were replaced by tight-lipped worry. Conversations that once flowed freely became minefields of unspoken anxiety about the mortgage, the grocery bills, the kids' futures. "We need to be realistic, Calvin," she'd say, her voice strained. "Maybe it's time to think about something else, something with a steady paycheck." Her words felt like a judgment on my life's work, on my father's legacy. I'd lash out, my frustration and fear twisting into anger. "This is what I do, Jenna. It's who I am. You want me to just give up on everything Dad built?" My younger brother, Leo, didn't help. He'd always lived in my shadow, or at least that's how he saw it. He worked a corporate job in the city, wore tailored suits, and viewed my calloused hands with a kind of smug pity. During his rare visits, he'd walk through my workshop with a critical eye. "Still playing with wood, huh?" he'd ask, a condescending smirk on his face. "You know there's a real world out there, Cal, one with benefits and a 401k. He saw my struggle not as a misfortune to be sympathized with, but as an inevitable outcome of my old-fashioned choices. My mother, Alina, was my only source of comfort. A gentle soul with a core of steel, she'd seen our family through hardships I could only imagine. She would sit with me at her kitchen table, a cup of tea warming my hands, and listen without judgment. "Your father had tough years too," she'd remind me, her voice soft but firm. "He never let it break him. You have his strength in you, Calvin, even if you can't feel it right now." But her words felt like a distant echo against the roar of my impending collapse. The bank sent letters, each one more aggressive thaw. In the last, the red ink of the past due stamps felt like blood on the page. I felt like I was drowning in slow motion, the life I'd so carefully constructed being pulled apart piece by piece. The weight of my father's legacy, once a source of pride, now felt like a millstone around my neck. He had built this reputation from nothing, and I was the one letting it crumble into dust. I was failing him, failing my family, and failing myself. The walls were closing in, and I couldn't see a single way out. The end came not with a bang, but with the quiet final click of a padlock on my workshop door. The eviction notice taped to the glass was stark and impersonal. The words blurred as I stood there, my hand resting on the cold metal, feeling the last 20 years of my life being locked away. The tools my father had passed down to me, the half-finished projects, the very air thick with memories, it was all gone. Walking away from that building felt like tearing out a part of my own soul. The silence that followed me home was deafening. Jenna was in the kitchen, packing a box with photos from our wedding. She didn't look up when I came in. The house was unnaturally tidy, stripped of the comfortable clutter that had made it a home. "I can't do this anymore, Calvin," she said, her voice flat and devoid of the warmth I had known for so long. "I can't watch the kids live with this uncertainty. They deserve stability. They deserve a father who isn't being crushed by the weight of his own pride." I tried to argue, to plead. I promised I would find a way, that I would get a different job, that this wasn't the end. But my words were hollow even to my own ears. She had already made her decision. The love and partnership that had been our foundation had eroded into fear and resentment. She looked at me not as her husband, but as a liability, a sinking ship she needed to escape. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "My sisters," she replied, taping the box shut with methodical precision. "The kids and I will stay there until I figure things out." The I in her sentence struck me harder than anything else. There was no more "we." The next morning, she loaded their suitcases into the car. Lily, my 7-year-old daughter, ran to me and hugged my legs, her face buried in my jeans. "Are you coming with us, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and confused. I knelt and held her tight, unable to form an answer. Sam, who was only 5, just stared at me from the car window, his expression a mixture of fear and bewilderment. He was too young to understand, but he knew something was terribly wrong. Jenna put her hand on Lily's shoulder. "Get in the car, sweetie." She wouldn't meet my eyes. As she drove away, the sight of my children's faces pressed against the rear window, watching me shrink into the distance, shattered what was left of my heart. I stood on that empty porch until the car was just a speck on the horizon, the silence of the house behind me a vast, echoing chasm. I thought I had reached the absolute bottom, but the universe had one more blow to deliver. My brother, Leo, showed up a few days later. He didn't knock, he just walked in, finding me sitting in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of my former life. He didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his face a mask of disappointment and contempt. "I heard about the workshop," he said, his tone sharp with judgment. "And Jenna called Mom, said she took the kids." He shook his head slowly, a condescending sigh escaping his lips. "You really did it, Cal. You ran Dad's legacy straight into the ground. All that talk about pride and craftsmanship, and for what? You're a failure. You've shamed our family's name." Every word was a perfectly aimed dagger. It wasn't just criticism, it was a verdict delivered by my own blood. I had always known he felt superior, but I never imagined he could be so cruel. The brother I had once built treehouses with, the one I had protected from bullies in the schoolyard, was now the one kicking me when I was down. The look in his eyes wasn't anger or even disappointment, it was satisfaction. He was finally seeing me as the worthless screw-up he'd always believed I was. "Get out," I managed to choke out. He just smirked, happy to. "This place reeks of despair." After he left, I was truly alone. The friends who had once filled my backyard for summer barbecues suddenly stopped answering my calls. People I had known my entire life would cross the street to avoid me. At the local diner, conversations would drop to a whisper when I walked in. I was no longer Calvin Hayes, the craftsman. I was Calvin Hayes, the man who had lost everything. Failure was a contagious disease, and no one wanted to get too close. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Each day was a battle just to get out of bed, to face the empty house and the crushy NG silence that was now my only companion. I was adrift in a sea of my own making, with no land in sight. The weeks that followed were a gray, featureless blur of despair. Time lost its meaning. Days bled into nights, measured only by the shifting shadows in the empty rooms of my house. I stopped answering the phone, letting the calls from creditors go to voicemail, where they piled up like digital tombstones marking the death of my old life. The only place I found a sliver of peace was the town cemetery, on the hill overlooking the valley. My father's grave was marked by a simple granite headstone beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. I'd go there and just sit, the silence of the place a welcome relief from the accusing silence of my home. I would talk to him, my words swallowed by the wind. I'd tell him how I'd messed everything up, how I'd lost the workshop, how Jenna and the kids were gone. I asked him for guidance, for a sign, for anything to pull me out of the suffocating darkness. Of course, no answer ever came. The cold stone remained impassive, a silent monument to a man whose approval I still craved, even in death. Then one evening, as I sat staring at the foreclosure notice that had arrived in the mail, the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, an unknown caller with no location ID. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let it join the chorus of unanswered calls, but something made me reach for it. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or just the sheer boredom of my broken existence. I swiped to answer, holding the phone to my ear without saying a word. For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice came through, low and raspy, like gravel being scraped across concrete. It was a man's voice, but it was digitally altered, cold, and metallic. It spoke a single chilling sentence. "Check under your father's grave. There's a box with your name on it." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat frozen in my chair, the phone still pressed to my ear, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice echoed in my mind, each word sharp and clear. It couldn't be real. It had to be a prank, a sick, twisted joke. My mind immediately jumped to Leo. Who else would be cruel enough to use our father's grave to torment me further? It was exactly his style, a calculated strike at my deepest vulnerabilities. The thought filled me with a surge of white-hot anger, followed by a wave of crushing hopelessness. Was he not satisfied with seeing me broken? Did he need to grind my face into the dirt as well? The next day, I drove to my mother's house. She was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, a half-finished quilt in her lap. The late afternoon sun illuminated the worry lines etched around her eyes. I told her everything about the call, the distorted voice, the bizarre message. She listened patiently, her hands never ceasing their steady, rhythmic stitching. When I finished, she set the quilt aside and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of concern and something else, something deeper: fear. "Your father was a complicated man, Calvin," she said, choosing her words with deliberate care. "He was private. He carried burdens he never shared with anyone, not even me." She paused, her gaze drifting toward an old, faded photograph of him on the mantelpiece. "He believed some things were meant to stay buried. Secrets are heavy and they were his to carry. I think you should leave this alone. Don't go digging up the past. It might bring you more pain than you're already in." Her warning unsettled me more than the call itself. She wasn't dismissing it as a prank. She was speaking as if she believed it could be true, and the thought that my father, the man I thought I knew, had secrets buried with him sent a shiver down my spine. What could he have possibly hidden that would make my gentle mother so afraid? I left her house more confused than ever. The voice on the phone had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, and my mother's warning had only made it grow. For the next few days, I was tormented. The message looped in my head, a constant nagging whisper. Every time I drove past the cemetery, my eyes were drawn to the oak tree on the hill. I pictured the earth beneath the headstone, imagining a hidden space, a void containing what? An answer, a trap, a final, cruel joke. The conflict raged inside me. My rational mind screamed that it was a prank, a pathetic attempt by Leo to push me over the edge. My mother's fearful words urged me to walk away, to let the dead rest in peace. But another part of me, the desperate, broken part that had nothing left to lose, felt an irresistible pull. The life I was living was a waking nightmare. What could possibly be worse than this? What secret could be more painful than the reality of my failure? The mystery of the box began to represent something more than a secret. It became a symbol of the unknown, a sea. Engli's wild card in a hand that had already been lost. It was a terrifying, illogical, and utterly captivating sliver of hope. The decision came on a Tuesday night. The house was cold, the silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure in my ears. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the final foreclosure notice from the bank. The red-stamped deadline was less than a week away. This was it. The last remnant of my life, the home where my children had been born, was about to be ripped away from me, my father's house. In that moment, the hollowness inside me was absolute. I had nothing. I was nothing. My mother's warning echoed in my mind. Some things are better left buried. But what did I have to lose by digging? My dignity? That was long gone. My family? Already lost. My home? It was as good as gone. The fear of what I might find in that box was finally eclipsed by the terror of my current reality. The unknown was no longer as frightening as the certain, bleak future that stretched before me. The mysterious voice on the phone hadn't offered a solution, but it had offered a possibility, and right now, a possibility was all I had. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. A strange sense of calm washed over me, the kind that comes when you've accepted the worst and are ready to face whatever comes next. I walked out to the old shed in the backyard. Leaning against the wall, covered in a thin layer of dust, was my father's shovel. The wooden handle was worn smooth in the exact places his hands would have gripped it. Picking it up, I felt its familiar weight. It felt less like a tool for digging and more like a key. I waited until the town was asleep. Just after midnight, when the world was cloaked in darkness and silence, I put the shovel in the back of my old pickup truck and drove toward the cemetery. The streets were deserted. My headlights cut a lonely path through the night. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. A part of me felt like a criminal, a grave robber defiling sacred ground. But another, stronger part felt like a son on a desperate pilgrimage, seeking a final message from his father. The iron gates of the cemetery were unlocked, creaking softly as I pushed them open. I parked the truck under the cover of some weeping willows near the edge of the grounds and killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the cool night breeze. I grabbed the shovel, its metal spade gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and started walking toward the hill. The oak tree stood like a giant, silent sentinel, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms over the rows of weathered headstones. My father's grave was at its base. I approached it slowly, each step heavy with a mixture of dread and anticipation. I had stood in this exact spot so many times, lost in grief and self-pity. Tonight was different. Tonight I was not here to talk, I was here to listen. I stood over the grave for a long moment, the shovel held loosely in my hand. I looked at the name carved into the stone, Arthur Hayes, beloved husband and father. "I don't know if this is real, Dad," I whispered into the darkness. "I don't know if this is a joke, but if you left something for me, I need it now. Forgive me if this is wrong." Then, taking a deep, shuddering breath, I drove the blade of the shovel into the soft earth just behind the headstone. The sound of tearing roots and displaced soil was shockingly loud in the stillness of the night. I fell into a frantic rhythm driven by a surge of adrenaline. Dig, lift, toss. Dig, lift, toss. Sweat beaded on my forehead and trickled down my back despite the chill in the air. My muscles, unaccustomed to this kind of labor after months of inertia, began to burn. With every scoop of dirt, my mind raced. Was I crazy? Was I desecrating my father's final resting place for nothing? What if Leo was hiding in the shadows, filming this for his own sick amusement? But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I was compelled by a force I didn't understand, a desperate need to see this through to the end. The hole grew deeper, 2 feet then 3, the soil became colder, denser. My breath came in ragged gasps. I paused for a second, leaning on the shovel, my heart pounding like a drum. The world was spinning slightly. I wiped the dirt from my face with the back of my hand and plunged the shovel back into the earth. And then I heard it, a solid, dull thud. It wasn't the sound of hitting a rock. It was the sound of metal striking wood. My breath caught in my throat. My heart leaped into my mouth. I dropped the shovel and fell to my knees, clawing at the loose dirt with my bare hands. My fingers scraped against something hard and flat. It was real. Frantically, I cleared the remaining soil away until the top of a small, dark wooden box was exposed. It was old, the wood weathered and stained by the damp earth, but it was solid. I worked my fingers around the edges, pulling and prying until it finally came loose with a sucking sound. It was heavier than I expected. I lifted it out of the hole and set it on the grass beside me. I sat back on my heels, panting, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I stared at it. And there, carved deep into the center of the lid, was a single word: my name. Calvin. For a long moment, I could only stare at the box, my mind unable to process what was in front of me. The wind whispered through the branches of the oak tree above, but I heard nothing. The world had gone silent. The box was not a prank. It was not a figment of my desperate imagination. It was real. My father had left this for me, buried in the earth, waiting. The realization sent a profound, bone-deep chill through me that had nothing to do with the night air. My hands trembled as I reached out and ran my fingers over the crudely carved letters of my name. The wood was rough and cold. Fear and hope waged a silent war in my chest. What was inside? A confession, a burden, a key to a past I knew nothing about. Every possibility felt equally terrifying and transformative. I thought of Jenna and the kids, of Leo's sneering face, of my mother's worried eyes. My entire life, past and future, seemed to converge on this single, terrifying moment. With a ragged breath that burned in my lungs, I found the simple latch on the front and pried the lid open. The hinges creaked in protest, releasing a musty smell of damp earth, aging wood, and something else, something that smelled like history. My eyes adjusted to the darkness inside. It wasn't empty. Neatly stacked within were several bundles wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Beneath them, something metallic caught a sliver of moonlight and gave off a soft, dull gleam. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached in and carefully lifted out the top bundle. The oilcloth was brittle with age, crackling as I unwrapped it. Inside was a thick stack of letters, the envelopes yellowed and the ink faded but still legible. They were all addressed to me, in my father's unmistakable, severe handwriting. I froze. My father had not been a writer. He was a man of action, of sawdust and steel. In my entire life, I could count the number of notes he'd written me on one hand, and they were usually just curt instructions left on the kitchen counter. To see this stack of letters, this volume of his silent voice, was more shocking than finding the box itself. With trembling hands, I set the letters aside and reached for the metallic object at the bottom. It was a heavy leather pouch, cinched tight with a worn cord. As I untied the knot, the pouch fell open in my palm and a stream of gold coins spilled out. They weren't shiny and new, they were old, their surfaces worn smooth with time, bearing the likeness of kings and eagles from a bygone era. They felt heavy, real, and utterly unbelievable. But there was one last thing in the box. Lying flat on the very bottom was a single folded piece of paper. It was newer than the letters, the paper crisper, the ink a darker black. My name was written on the outside. My fingers shook as I unfolded it. It wasn't a long letter, just a few short lines in my father's hand. For when you think you have lost everything. A man's worth is not measured by what he builds, but by how he rises after the fall. These coins are not wealth, but a beginning. The letters will tell you the rest. Do not give up, Calvin, you are not a failure. The last four words shattered me. A raw, guttural sob escaped my chest, a sound of such profound grief and relief that it seemed to tear through the silence of the cemetery. Tears I didn't know I had left to cry streamed down my face, blurring the words on the page. I collapsed back into the dirt, clutching the note to my chest, and wept. I wept for the boy who had always sought his father's approval and never received it. I wept for the man who had come to believe he was worthless. I wept for the love that had been there all along, hidden away, silent but enduring. All my life I had measured myself against his impossible standards, always falling short. He had pushed me, criticized me, and maintained a stoic distance that I had interpreted as disappointment. But here, in his own words, was the validation, the comfort, the raw, undiluted belief I had craved for 40 years. When the storm of emotion passed, I felt hollowed out but clean. I picked up the first letter from the stack and carefully opened it. The paper was fragile, but his handwriting was as strong as I remembered him. Son, it began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and life has brought you to your knees. I know it would. Life is designed to test you, to strip you of everything you hold dear until you believe you have nothing left. But you must not believe it. I left you this box not to save you from your troubles, but to remind you of the strength you carry inside. It is my strength. It is our blood. You are more than your failures. Each word was a revelation. It was as if he had seen the future, had known the exact shape of the despair that would one day consume me. I read on, letter after letter, there in the cold dirt beside his open grave. He wrote of his own struggles, the fears he had never voiced, the mistakes that haunted him. He confessed that his silence had not been a lack of love, but a shield built by his own father, a misguided attempt to forge strength through hardship. He wrote of his pride in the man I had become, a pride he had been too stubborn or too scared to ever express out loud. By the time the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, I had read them all. I was shivering from the cold, but a fire had been lit inside me. The gold coins were a tangible asset, a lifeline, but the letters were the real treasure. They were a map, a guide, a final gift of a father's wisdom. I looked at his headstone, no longer seeing a cold slab of granite, but a symbol of a love that had transcended death. The anger and resentment I had harbored for years had vanished, replaced by a profound, aching gratitude. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I understand." I carefully placed the letters and the pouch of coins back in the box and carried it to my truck as if it were the most sacred object on earth. As I drove away, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the valley. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, it was no longer dark. My father had given me more than a second chance. He had given me back myself. I didn't sleep when I got home. I sat at my kitchen table as the sun filled the room, the wooden box sitting before me like an altar. My father's final note lay on top, its words burned into my memory, "You are not a failure." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the suffocating weight of despair had lifted. It was still there, a dull ache in the background, but it no longer defined me. My life was still in ruins, but now I held a blueprint for rebuilding it. The coins were the foundation. I took a handful to a reputable appraiser in a neighboring city, a man who wouldn't ask questions. His eyes widened as he examined them. They were rare, he told me, worth more than I could have imagined. I sold just enough to halt the foreclosure on my house and pay off the most predatory of my debts. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The rest of the coins I hid away, not as a treasure to be hoarded, but as my father had intended, a beginning. A safety net that allowed me to stand up without the fear of immediately being knocked back down. But I knew the money wasn't the answer, it was just the tool. The real work had to be done with my own two hands. My father's letters had reminded me of a fundamental truth I had forgotten in my pursuit of success. A man's dignity is found in his labor. I didn't try to restart my old business. The thought of it was still too painful, too tied to my fall. Instead, I started from the bottom. I took on day labor jobs, hauling lumber for construction crews, repairing fences, doing the grueling, thankless work that others avoided. It was humbling. Men who had once sought my expertise now directed me as a simple laborer. But with every splinter in my hands, every ache in my back, I felt something being rebuilt inside me. It was pride. Not the arrogant pride of a successful business owner, but the quiet, solid pride of a man earning his keep one day at a time. I was tired at the end of the day, but it was a good kind of tired, the exhaustion that comes from honest work, not from sleepless nights of worry. My mother was the first to see the change. She stopped by one afternoon with a casserole, her usual offering of quiet support. She watched me as I came in from the yard, covered in dirt and sweat. She didn't say anything at first, just studied my face. "You look different, Calvin," she said finally, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. "You're standing taller." I told her she was right, that I felt different. I didn't tell her about the box, that secret felt too personal, too sacred to share just yet, but I told her I had found a new path. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered, and for the first time I knew it was true. With a newfound sense of stability, I knew I had to face the biggest piece of my broken life, my family. I wrote a letter to Jenna. I didn't ask her to come home or make any demands. I simply told her the truth. I told her I was sorry for my pride, for letting my fear turn into anger, for allowing my failure to poison our home. I told her I was working again, that I was slowly getting back on my feet, and that my only goal was to become a father that Lily and Sam could be proud of again. I sealed the envelope with no expectation of a reply. "Why?" A week later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, her car pulled into the driveway. My heart leaped into my throat. She got out, followed by Lily and Sam. Lily saw me on the porch and broke into a run, her little arms wrapping around my waist in a hug that nearly broke me. Sam was more hesitant, hiding behind his mother's legs, but when I knelt and opened my arms, he ran to me too. Jenna watched us from a distance, her expression cautious. There were no easy smiles, no promises of reconciliation, but there was no anger in her eyes either. There was just a weary sort of curiosity. "I'm glad you're doing better, Calvin," she said softly. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an open door, and that was more than I had dared to hope for. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. I ran into Leo at the local hardware store. He saw me in my dirty work clothes, loading bags of concrete mix into my truck. He sauntered over, a familiar, condescending smirk on his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Look at how the mighty have fallen, from master craftsman to common laborer. I guess some people find their level." A year ago, his words would have gutted me. They would have confirmed every dark thought I had about myself. But now they felt like hollow echoes from a life that was no longer mine. I straightened up, turned to face him, and looked him directly in the eye. I didn't feel anger, only a strange sort of pity for him. "I'm not a failure, Leo," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Dad knew it and I know it now, that's all that matters." The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of confusion. He had expected me to crumble, to lash out, to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. My quiet confidence disarmed him. He scoffed, shook his head, and walked away without another word. His power over me was broken. My father's words had built a foundation inside me that my brother's bitterness could no longer crack. A year can change everything. 12 months after I dug up my father's box, my life was unrecognizable from the wreckage it had been. I hadn't magically rebuilt my old life. I had built a new one on a stronger, more honest foundation. The day labor had evolved. I started a small handyman and repair business working out of my garage. My reputation in town shifted from the man who had failed spectacularly to the man who refused to stay down. The whispers in the diner were replaced by nods of respect. People didn't hire me out of pity. They hired me because I was reliable, skilled, and took pride in my work, no matter how small the job. My relationship with Jenna and the children was slowly healing. They hadn't moved back in, the wounds were too deep for such a quick fix, but the door that had been opened that Sunday afternoon had stayed open. We started with weekend visits, awkward at first, but gradually filled with the comfortable rhythms of family life. We took the kids to the park, ate pizza on Friday nights, and I helped Lily with her math homework. I was no longer a ghost in their lives, but a presence. Jenna and I started talking again, really talking. We spoke of our fears, our resentments, and the mistakes we both had made. She admitted her fear had made her run, and I admitted my pride had pushed her away. There was no simple path back to what we were, but we were forging a new one, built on forgiveness and a shared love for our children. The hope of our family being whole again was no longer a distant dream, but a tangible possibility we were working toward every day. The box my father left me sat on a shelf in my living room. It was no longer a secret buried in the earth, but a visible reminder of my second chance. Sometimes, on nights when doubt crept in, I would open it. I rarely looked at the coins anymore. Instead, I would pull out one of the letters and read my father's words. They were a constant source of strength, a voice of reason and love that guided me through uncertainty. He had given me more than a financial rescue. He had given me a new perspective on life, on failure, and on the true meaning of a man's worth. One clear, crisp autumn morning, a year to the day after that fateful night, I drove back to the cemetery. I walked up the hill to the oak tree, a bouquet of fresh wildflowers in my hand. The ground where I had dug was now covered with grass, leaving no trace of the desperate act that had changed my life. I knelt and placed the flowers against the cool granite of my father's headstone. I didn't need to speak to him in whispers anymore. The conversation he had started a year ago was ongoing, a constant presence in my mind. I stayed there for a while, not in grief, but in a state of profound peace and gratitude. "I found it, Dad," I said quietly to the wind. "I found the box and I found my way back. Thank you. Thank you for believing in me, especially when I couldn't believe in myself." The branches of the great oak rustled above me, a sound like a gentle sigh. No voice answered, but I felt his presence all around me. I was not the same man who had stood on this spot, broken and begging for a sign. I was a man who had fallen, yes, but I had also risen. My father had saved me not by erasing my problems, but by giving me the strength to face them. He taught me that our legacy isn't written in our successes, but in how we endure our failures. Because of him, I could stand tall again, not just for myself, but for the family I was slowly, carefully, and lovingly putting back together.